Hello and welcome to Sam E.C. Press. So today we're cracking into something more than Shakespeare Poetry Workbook for our first poet, that of Walt Whitman. He was born in 1919 and died in 1892. He had 7 siblings. He was born in Long Island, New York. He only attended school from the ages of 6 to 11. Later on, he served as a nurse during the Civil War. When Walt Whitman began publishing his poems in the mid-1800s, he forever changed the look and sound of poetry. Walt Whitman liked to view himself as a poet for the common man and woman, the everyday people, not just the well-to-do. Many people who worked with their hands were subjects of his poems, as well as animals, plants, cities, and farms. This was unlike the British fireside poems about moral and domestic topics that were to be memorized in school. Walt Whitman did not follow the crowd. You see, before Walt, the true poem had a regular pattern and meter called and rhyme. This called for a strict order of the writer's thoughts and emotions in a very organized form. Well, Whitman's words flow across the page freely without the chains of rigid rules or the stress of following the structure of what was considered true poetry. Whitman gives us much detail as we read through his poems. Where did Walt receive his creativity? He told people that it was his very own mother. Did you know he only attended school until he was 11 years old? Why, you may ask? Well, he had to go to work to help support his family who were struggling financially. At the age of 11, do you know what job he had? He worked at a law office. So, clearly his education continued despite not going to school. This job helped Whitman with his handwriting and his composition. His employer, Edward Clark, signed Whitman up at a local lending library, which opened the door for a lifetime love of literature. Don't we all love and appreciate our local libraries? I know we at Sam E.C. Press do. Next, though, still as a teen, he started to write short pieces that appeared in papers. He also became a journalist. You will not believe this, but next, Walt Whitman became a school teacher. I know, you're thinking, you just told me that he only went to school to the age of 11. How could he possibly be a school teacher? Things were much different back then. You know, in Walt's day, teachers would hit their students with rulers and pointers. But not Walt. He refused to hit his students. Crazy enough, this made parents concerned about his relaxed method of teaching. Ralph Waldo Emerson, another poet, opened Walt's eyes to what he could do as a writer. Emerson encouraged his audience to follow their inner promptings in all things. In one of his talks, Whitman heard Emerson calling for a new type of poet, one who would set free the imagination, and by doing so, transform the world. What a mind-blowing moment for Walt. Leaves of Grass was Whitman's first collection of poems. This was in 1855, when Walt was at the age of 36. Since this was a new style, and not considered true poetry, Whitman was met with criticism. Here is one example of what was printed. Walt must be some escaped lunatic, raving in pitiable delirium. Why such cruelty? Because Whitman was writing an entirely new kind of poetry, one that was about everyday life. Remember Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet who had changed Whitman's thinking? Well, he wrote Walt a letter calling his book the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I greet you at the beginning of a great career. Now, Whitman made a bit of a mistake here, and Emerson did not forgive him. This is what Emerson said. I like you, Walt, but I will never forgive you for publishing the letter I wrote you in the second edition of Leaves of Grass without my permission. That was personal, and our friendship is over, you half-song thrush, half-alligator. I found that to be quite an interesting insult. Despite the interesting quote from Emerson, this was an exciting time for him, because Whitman was the very poet he was speaking about in his lecture. How exciting for both of them to be taking these steps to break free from the mold of the day. Whitman admired President Abraham Lincoln and was devastated by his assassination in 1865. He wrote a poem for Lincoln entitled, "O Captain, My Captain." Whitman later moved to Camden, New Jersey. Some of you may have even seen the bridge named after him in your travels. The Walt Whitman Bridge is a suspension bridge across the Delaware River connecting Philadelphia, Pennsylvania with Gloucester City, New Jersey. Interestingly, even with the rough start and criticism, when Whitman died in 1892, he was regarded as one of the most important and accomplished, as well as the most loved writers America had yet produced. Today we're going to discuss only one of the many, many poems that he has written. This one is called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself, in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. You could see from looking at this poem that the words literally flow off the page. It was a bit difficult with formatting. I love what Walt is telling us here. He doesn't want us to get lost in information, in the blah blah blah. Remember, Walt did not have to sit through much school and the blah blah that comes along with such a thing. He was able to learn without the structures and strictures of a schoolroom. He had interest-led learning. He learned firsthand the importance of observation as well as discovery. In the poem, the speaker becomes tired and sick, thinking there are no charts or diagrams that could explain the speaker's feelings. He finds the astronomer's scientific perspective on the star is intolerable. Have you ever felt that way? Hopefully you're not feeling that way right now. The speaker chooses to turn away from scientific analysis and to be immersed in nature, believing in the power and beauty of nature that cannot be measured or explained. He simply wanders off. How the silence contrasts with the astronomer's wordy and unbearable lecture. Do you agree with the speaker that sometimes it's better to just have silence to be able to think and observe? While the natural world can be examined in scientific terms, experiencing nature directly can be more beneficial for us and have a deeper meaning. Although the astronomer is learned, in other words, well-read and knowledgeable, the poem seems to imply that all the book learning in the world isn't a substitute for actual experience as well as reflection. Do you agree or disagree? There are many, many, many other poems by Walt Whitman, and we've only discussed one. In the workbook, we also have O Captain, My Captain, as well as To a Locomotive in Winter. I hope that you have enjoyed this discussion of Walt, and maybe you found that you like his poetry, but maybe, not your favorite. Well, stay tuned as we discuss the next poet next week. Until then,